I'm Senate historian Betty Koed, and this is The Elephant in the Room.
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. I'm your host, Cyrus Pearson, and we've got two twists for today's show. First, I'm joined by some new co-hosts. Go ahead and say hello.
Hello.
Hey.
I don't hear Sophie there. We normally mention these guys at the end of every episode, but now we're giving them some time in front of the microphone. Elena and Carly, thanks for showing up and sharing your voice today.
Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, we enjoyed it.
Our second twist is we had the Senate historian instead of an actual senator today. We thought that would be kind of interesting to bring you the history behind it. What did you all think?
I thought she was a Rolodex of information. Her details of stories were incredible, and of course the dates. She can tell you what happened on what day, almost like in a snap of a finger.
I forget birthdays. It's crazy. And Carly, what did you think?
She has a depth of knowledge. I mean, she basically is your history book in walking human form.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, I don't need to say anything more. Let's hear from her. Betty, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Speaking of history, we just updated our studio, and you are actually the first guest in our new facility. So you're making history here, not just simply talking about it.
I don't often get to make Senate history. I usually report on it, but I'm happy to do so.
And we're happy to have you here for this rare occasion. We've got lots of great topics you can talk about, but first, tell us a little about the role of Senate historian. A lot of people probably haven't even considered that was a role that exists over here. What is it you do, and how did you get here?
It's not a high-profile position, that's true, because we are institutional historians. So as a Senate historian, I really serve as the institutional memory for the Senate. I'm here to provide historical information to senators or staff, officers, to the public, the press, whoever it may be that wants Senate history information. And we're here to make sure that all the Senate's records are properly archived, transferred to the National Archives, or in the case of senators' papers, they go to home state repositories. So we have two very important roles. One is to record the institutional memory of the Senate. The other is to ensure that the Senate's official papers and senators' personal papers are archived properly for future research. Beyond that, we have lots of jobs we do. We do talks and tours. We do oral history interviews with senators and staff. We provide oversight to the Capitol Visitor Center and all of its historical endeavors. We work a lot with the Capitol Guide Service in the Capitol to be sure that the tours are accurate, that type of thing.
Wow.
We produce publications that range all the way from pamphlets about the history of this building we're in today, all the way up to, thousands of pages of reference books, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I also, as Senate historian, oversee all of the historical content on the Senate website. We currently have about 12,000 pages. We haven't counted lately, but that's about what we think it is, of historical material on the Senate website, and I oversee all of that material as well.
Wow,
That's
very
amazing.
cool.
That is totally amazing.
And we have so much to get into. One more thing before we do that. Who contacts you the most, would you say?
Staff, I would say.
What kind of things are they looking
We
for?
get a lot of calls from staff. Sometimes it's just for archival stuff. On a daily basis, we work with committee staff, we work with members' offices staff, and just to ensure that their papers are getting properly preserved. And that's probably our most frequent call. Next to that, maybe the press might come after that.
Really?
We do a lot of work with media in all formats, and we are here as kind of like the reference officers for the Senate. We're sort of public information officers in a way. We're one of the few offices in the Senate under the Secretary of the Senate in the administrative part of the Senate that is allowed to talk directly to the public. And so the press come to us looking for precedents, looking for background information. So if something happens, if there's an important nomination announced, for instance, reporters will often come to us to ask about, has this person ever been nominated before? What's his background? What's the confirmation process like? Has there been contentious confirmation processes in the past? So they're always looking for historical background, and we're the source for that.
And would all of this history that you guys have archived be available to the public on any format?
Yes. We have, a lot of it is on the Senate website, so we put a lot of institutional information on the website. We also have a lot of reference information on the website. We also keep in the historical office in the Hart Building thousands of files We have a file on every single senator who's ever served since 1789.
Wow.
So that we've now passed the 2,000 mark. So
Oh
more
my
than
gosh.
2,000 senators. All of the vice presidents who have served and served as president of the Senate. Plus we have subject files and Congress by Congress files. And we deal a lot with historians and political scientists who are researching the history of the Senate or the history of Congress. And they often come to our office, camp out for a while, go through our files, talk to one of the three historians. I have two deputy historians as well, and they talk to us about Senate history. And but we're here we're a public office, and so we're here to help in any way we can.
I can only imagine that your organizational skills have to be top tier for all of this
Yes.
information. And you have to have optimal office space or something.
Well, I don't know about optimal office space. We're pretty crammed into our office in the Hart Building, I have to say. You know, space is limited on Capitol Hill, as you well know.
Absolutely.
We have a small office on the second floor where 10 of my staff members are, and we also have, or I should say 9 of my staff, and we have 3 staff members in a basement office as well. In addition, I should mention we also have a photo and image collection of about 50, 60,000 images, and which cover the full breadth of Senate history, illustrations from the 19th century daguerreotype images of senators from the 1860s and 70s, all the way up to what's been happening yesterday. We have a photo historian on staff who's archives and preserves and organizes that collection, and we have that housed in our basement office as well.
What an
That's
important
amazing.
office,
Yeah,
especially for our future generations as
Yeah.
well.
Yep.
Well, let's talk about some of the history and tap some of that knowledge. I don't want to steal all the thunder. Carly, you want to go first?
Sure. So the Senate first convened on March 4th, 1789. Why was the Senate created originally?
It's a good question. You know, when the framers met in Philadelphia in 1787, they essentially put in place the basic foundation for what became the Senate 2 years later. And clearly looking at what they did and how they debated the creation of the Senate, we have a good idea of what they had in mind. And what they had in mind was for the Senate to be kind of an advisory body to both the president and to the House of Representatives. For that reason, they made the Senate have stronger qualifications. You know, the members had to be older than House members. Senators had to be older than representatives. And they had to be citizens for a longer period of time. They had basic qualifications that suggested the framers wanted them to be an older, more experienced body. Importantly, they also made them be elected every 6 years instead of every 2 years. And for that reason, they were removing them from some of the pressures of public opinion. They wanted the Senate to be kind of a elite body that could kind of stand away from the pressures of public opinion and be more independent because of that.
Okay.
So
And-
while in the House every 2 years you're trying to get reelected, in the
Yep.
Senate you got some time to actually accomplish
That's
something.
exactly it. And you don't have to deal directly with the constituents. And because another part of that original design for the Senate was that senators were indirectly elected. In other words, they were elected by state legislatures, not by the people.
Oh,
From 1789 until 1913, no senator was directly elected to the Senate. They were all elected by their state legislatures.
what initiated that change?
In 1913, we passed and ratified a constitutional amendment, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, that changed how senators are chosen. And at that point, it made them directly elected by the people of their state. Now, the efforts to make that happen began as early as the 1820s. There was a House resolution in 1826 that suggested senators needed to be directly elected. But it took almost 100 years for that reform effort to come to fruition and actually create a constitutional amendment that could pass and be ratified in 1913. So it's a long story to
long
get to that
history.
point. And really, a lot of it came from the state legislatures. The problem was, by the time you get to the post-Civil War era, 1880s, 1890s, the system of electing senators had become corrupted. And it had become corrupted in a variety of ways. First, during the Civil War years, the turmoil of the Civil War years produced a lot of vacancies in Senate offices. And so a lot of state legislatures, caught up in the political turmoil of wartime, were unable to decide who would be their 2 U.S. senators. So some states went through long vacancies. Delaware, I think it was, had a 4-year vacancy in the Senate where they had no senators at all, for instance, because their state legislature could not decide on 2 candidates. Also, the state legislatures began to become subject to bribes and other types of coercion. So people wanted to be elected senators. We began to see bribery at the state legislature level. So really, the call for reform comes from the state legislature, who want to be free of this responsibility and free of the corruption that had integrated the system itself.
And then they gave it back to the people.
And so they give it to the people. And so from 1913 on, every single senator has been directly elected by the people of his or her state.
That's amazing.
I'm sorry, let me jump in. Do you think we've nailed it now, or are we in a constant state of reform as we try to figure this out and get it right?
Well, there are calls. There have been calls in the last 10 years or so to go back to the indirect election system. And that, my prediction is, will never, ever happen.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, what comes with a directly elected Senate? One thing is they have to face the constituents on a regular basis. They now no longer have that distance, that buffer zone from the constituency that they had before. But also that meant they had to raise money to campaign. Senators had to campaign for office now. And so the whole concept of campaign funding issues really for the Senate begins in the early 1900s, and that has grown into recent years, as you well know. And so there have been some political scientists and others who have said maybe we should go back to the indirect election system. So reform is never ending.
Yeah.
There's always a reform to the last reform, and but I don't think that will ever happen.
Just one more thing, Elena. I'm sorry. I'm going to let you hop in here. But if you can clear something up for me while we're on this subject, because we just came off of the August state work period, it's called. Other people call it recess, but for PC purposes, we'll call it the state work period. Is that because it was so hot, or did we used to have part-time legislators and they wrapped everything up by August? I mean, what used to be going on in the Senate?
All of those things are true.
Okay.
They're all part of the story. Throughout the 19th century and really into the mid-20th century, we were a part-time legislature. Except in times of war and crisis, it was typical for the Senate on a non-election year, for instance, they would be out of session usually by May or June, and they'd be out the rest of the year.
Oh.
In non-election years, they typically would adjourn by the end of July, and they'd be out the rest of the year. Now, keep in mind, in the earliest years, Congresses began in December. We now begin in January. That's a 20th century reform effort. So they would come in for a few months. They'd be out by July or August, and they'd go home, and they'd be back in their home states until December. And so 6 months or more of the year, they wouldn't be here. And that's because that was what the workload demanded at the time. A lot of things changed in the early 20th century with the First World War and particularly the Second World War. And the growth of the nation, but also a massive growth in the responsibilities of our nation in the post-World War II era really put extra demands on Congress. So by the time you get to the 1940s and 50s, Congress is working well past that July date. And in fact, by the early 1960s, they're typically going from January to December with no more than a 3-day weekend off anywhere.
Yeah.
So by the 1960s, earlier, or I should say younger members of Congress began to call for a summer break, a summer recess, so they could go home, they could spend time with their families, they could have family vacations, that type of thing. And but the old timers didn't want to do that. The old timers were tied to this, let's get our business done by August, let's leave and go home for the next 4 months. It was a battle of generations to some extent. But also fueling that in the early years was the fact that the Capitol didn't have an efficient air conditioning system until the 1930s and really even until the 1950s. And so it got pretty hot in Washington then, just as it does now.
Yes.
So by the time you got to May or June, people were really ready to get out. You know, there's a famous saying that Vice President John Nance Garner, who was vice president in the 1930s, he said that no good business ever comes out of Congress after June, and he was referring to the fact it was just too hot to make any decisions. You know? So it's kind of a combination of all of those factors led to that. Finally, with the 1970 Reorganization Act, which was a big congressional reform act, they established that Congress would adjourn every year for the month of August. In 1971, they put that into place, and it's been there ever since.
Very interesting.
I can only imagine working in, I just want to imagine, I don't want to experience, working in the Capitol with no air conditioner. Even this week, we're in September, and it's supposed to be in the 90s.
It's near 100 degrees today.
Insane.
Yeah, it's unbearable.
Yeah.
It did make for some really great photo ops, though. You know, we have photographs from the 1920s and 30s of senators frying eggs on the sidewalk. and
Wow.
things like that. Yeah,
Wow. That's
Breakfast
great.
is served.
yeah. Yeah.
We were going to dial it back if that's okay. The War of 1812 is one that a lot of us learn in history classes, and even maybe here, but English is crazy. In the Capitol when they do like congressional tours or something. So the War of 1812, like, can you tell us about that time and how like the old Senate chamber had to be rebuilt after the fire kind of went down?
Well, we went to war with Britain in 1812. It was sort of the last battle of the Revolutionary War, really. We had sort of won the war and created a treaty with Britain in 1783, but the conflict with Britain continued through the years. And so it erupted into another war in 1812. In August of 1814, August 24th, we haven't gone too far past that date right now. Actually, I just thought about that.
Yeah.
But in August of 1814, British troops marched on Washington and set the Capitol on fire. And at the time, the Capitol didn't look like it does now. You know, there was a Senate wing that had been completed, there was a House wing that had been completed, and there was a wooden walkway that connected those two buildings. The dome wasn't there, the rotunda wasn't there. All of that came after the fire.
Oh, wow.
So it was the early formation of the Capitol building itself. And they set fire to the Capitol. It destroyed most of the Capitol. It left it mostly just a burnt shell of a building. And that included the original Senate chamber, both the chamber that we think of now as the old Supreme Court chamber, which is on the bottom floor, and one floor above that. In 1810, the Senate had moved to what we now call the old Senate chamber on the second floor. And that chamber just got destroyed. It was described by Benjamin Latrobe, the architect, as a magnificent ruin after the fire.
Wow.
And the beautiful marble pillars had essentially melted to the ground. The destruction was really widespread.
That's crazy.
So Congress moved out of the Capitol, obviously, in 1814 after the fire, and they didn't come back until the Capitol in 1819. And over those 5 years, the building that had been in place was rebuilt, and they started to fill in the spaces in between what became the crypt and the rotunda, and then eventually the dome on top of that. The Senate chamber, the room we now call the old Senate chamber, which was the Senate's home from 1810 to 1859, that was completely rebuilt, redesigned. It was made in a larger chamber, and it is the beautiful chamber you see there today. The chamber that you see in the Capitol now that tourists see when they come on Capitol tours, that is really what the chamber looked like from that sort of 1820 to 1860 time period.
Wow. The proceedings of Congress, you said they were gone for 5 years. Did they hold any types of Congress sessions, anything while they were rebuilding the Capitol, or no?
Yes, congressional business went on without a break. It's like, keep in mind, they were on that schedule of the 19th century, and so we're in that August, September, October period. So they didn't come back to convene really until December. There were a couple little emergency meetings here and there, but they did move out of the Capitol for obvious reasons. They moved downtown first to a building called Blodgett's Hotel, an old hotel,
Really?
which was one of the few buildings that had survived the fire of 1814. And then they subsequently built a new building that became known as the Brick Capitol, which was built on the site of where the Supreme Court stands today. And so really from 1815 to 1819, Congress met, as well as the Supreme Court, in that building that became known as the Brick Capitol. By 1819, enough of the Capitol had been rebuilt that they were able to move back home into the Capitol and back into their chamber. Now, it's interesting if you go into the current Senate chamber and you see those 100 historic desks there in the current Senate chamber. Well, 48 of those desks date back to 1819, date back to the reconstruction of the Capitol after the fire.
Really?
Oh my gosh.
Jumping into that, you said the historic desks are still there of what we see today. One of the saddest and most interesting history moments in 1856 was the caning of Charles Sumner. What happened? How did that get sparked? Why was there such a brutal attack in the Capitol?
Yeah, that's a famous moment in Senate history, and it was a turning point in American history in a lot of ways. That happened in the old chamber, in the old Senate chamber, in 1856, May of 1856. And this was during the time, the 1850s were a very tumultuous period in U.S. history. This is the decade leading into the Civil War, where all of the ongoing arguments about what sort of nation we will be, how we will grow, will we move to the western coast, how big will we be, and most importantly, will we be an enslaved nation or will we be a free nation? That was the key part of that debate.
Okay.
In 1854, Congress passed a landmark piece of legislation known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that was all about settling the territory of the Kansas territory and the Nebraska territory and creating states from that territory. But the question, of course, was, when those states were created, would they allow slavery or would they prohibit slavery? 2 years later, that bill passed. And 2 years later, the opposition to that bill was so strong yet in Congress that people like Charles Sumner, a pretty new senator from Massachusetts at the time, were delivering speeches regularly complaining about that bill and it should be repealed because it allows for the potential of Western slavery in Western states. In May 19th of 1856, Charles Sumner goes to the floor of the Senate chamber, the old Senate chamber, and he delivers what he calls, a speech he calls the Crime Against Kansas. And in that speech, he denounces the Kansas-Nebraska Act, calls for it to be repealed, and importantly, singles out individual members of the Senate who had been key proponents of that bill. And one of them was Stephen Douglas of Illinois. Another was a South Carolina senator named Andrew Butler. And it was a really powerful but also radical speech. It was a speech that was unlike most they had heard of that day. Speech making was fairly polite at that time period, and his speech was not polite at all. And it used a lot of sexual innuendo, which was unusual at the time. He referred to slavery as the harlot slavery, and he talked about the slavery being the mistresses of senators. And people were very offended by the speech. We look back at it now as this great oratorical triumph, but it was a radical and much criticized speech at the time. A couple days later, Sumner is sitting in the chamber at his desk, signing his signature to copies of the speech to mail out to people. And a representative from South Carolina, a man named Preston Brooks, comes into the chamber. It's the end of the day. He comes into the chamber. He approaches Sumner at his desk, and he raises his heavy walking stick. And he says to Sumner something like, I heard your speech. It is an offense to my kin and to my state. And down comes the cane. And over the course of about a minute, he inflicts about 40 wounds on the head and shoulders of Charles
Oh my
Sumner.
goodness.
Ouch.
The beating, the caning, the famous caning of Charles Sumner leaves Sumner bleeding and unconscious on the floor of the Senate chamber.
Whoa.
And Sumner's carried out of the chamber and taken home to get medical attention. Sumner really doesn't come back to the Senate for about another 3 years. He comes back a few months later, but he's so troubled by headaches and dizziness and ongoing convalescence issues that he goes away again. But he does come back to the Senate in 1859. He serves another 15 years until his death in 1874. That's the most famous moment in Charles Sumner's Senate career. But I would argue the most important moment in Sumner's career comes later on. In 1870, Charles Sumner introduces a civil rights bill. It's a landmark civil rights bill that is designed to to end discrimination, racial discrimination in all forms of public accommodation. Now, for those who know their civil rights history, that's what the 1964 Civil Rights Act did. In 1870, Sumner introduces essentially the same bill. It gets sent to committee where it dies. He reintroduces it in 1871, 1872, 1873. He dies in 1874 without the bill having passed. The next year, they do pass the bill, a kind of watered-down version of his bill, but it's ultimately declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883. Now, it's interesting because in 1964, when senators are again debating civil rights, and they're debating these very issues, racial desegregation for public accommodations, they look back to Sumner's bill as one of the models to follow. And particularly Illinois Senator Everett Dirksen, who was the Republican minority leader at the time in 1964, looks back to Sumner's case to see how to make the current bill pass constitutional muster. And so in 1875, Sumner's bill passes, gets declared unconstitutional, but it lays the foundation for what becomes the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So that's really the most important moment in Sumner's career. There are many others. I mean, he had important issues during the Civil War. He was chair of the Foreign Relations Committee and that stuff. But he has this very famous moment in 1856 and this incredibly landmark legislative moment in the 1870s.
Is it too much to assume that the caning of Sumner led to the Civil War?
It is certainly one of the factors that puts it that way. Not so much leading to it, but a signal that it's coming. You know, once the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, the debate never stops until we end up in Civil War in 1861. But the caning of Sumner was an indication that all these legislative compromises that had been designed and passed in order to sort of hold the issues down and keep the turmoil down to avoid Civil War were probably no longer going to help. And so it's one of the indicators that Civil War is coming.
We also were really intrigued to hear your take on the chandelier, the small rotunda chandelier. There have been many myths that we've heard, been told, maybe have recited a time or two. So set us straight here. That chandelier in the small rotunda, that didn't come from the Titanic, did it?
No, it did not. And if you stop and think about it, if that chandelier had been on the Titanic when the Titanic sunk, it would still be on the Titanic in the bottom of the sea.
Right.
How would it have gotten to the Capitol?
Very true.
If you really think through that story, you'll know that it cannot be true.
Oh my goodness.
But that chandelier is a popular topic for Capitol myths and stories. There's no doubt about it. Now, there are many beautiful and historic chandeliers in the Capitol, but for some reason, this one has become a real focal point because it does hang in a very prominent spot, you know, right in the old Senate wing of the Capitol. In the middle, we have this little rotunda spot, which originally did not have a chandelier. It was just sort of, it had a skylight and ventilation process. But it's a perfect spot to hang something like that. Now, the true story behind that chandelier is that it originally was imported from Europe in the early 1900s, and it hung in a theater in Baltimore for about 50 years. And in 1950, that theater was demolished, and so a lot of its furniture and light fixtures and stuff were removed. And the chandelier was purchased by a church in Washington, D.C., so it hung for quite a few years in a church in Washington, D.C. Ultimately, that church was also demolished, and the chandelier was given to a second-hand dealer. And in 1965, the architect of the Capitol was looking for something to fill that space in the little rotunda, and he purchased the chandelier for about $1,500, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
And it's hung in that space
Wow.
ever since. So it doesn't have this sort of dramatic history behind it that the myths like to portray, but it's been around for a while. So recently it's been, not only did it once hang in a Baltimore brothel, which is not true, once it hung on the Titanic, which is not true. I've also recently heard someone say that all the little pieces of glass you see there are Tiffany diamonds.
Oh my
that were
goodness.
hand cut for this. Well, if every one of those was a Tiffany diamond, we probably could pay off the national debt with it.
Good. You are just crushing interns and
yeah, yeah.
visitors, myths all alike.
Yeah, it has a fairly mundane history, actually, but it's been in the Capitol since 1965.
It is a beautiful chandelier.
It's a pretty
hard
chandelier.
to miss.
Yeah.
Absolutely
yeah.
beautiful. Did it have electrical features already before the AOC purchased it, or did the AOC put that in?
Architect
No.
of the Capitol.
Yeah, the architect, AOC is architect of the Capitol, that's right. No, it came electrified. I mean, this was brought into the Baltimore Theater in the early 1900s when electricity was already in place, and so it's always been electric. We do have chandeliers in the Capitol that were originally gas-powered and have been modified to accommodate electricity, but that's not one of them.
Oh, okay.
I can only imagine the cleaning process of that too.
Oh,
No pressure to whoever has to clean that.
it has to be taken apart piece by piece to be cleaned, is what the curators have told me. So
Wow.
that is quite a process.
a lengthy one.
Let's get to one kind of fun thing I did not know about, and both Carly and Elena were interns and gave tours and took the whole tour experience of how to do it. I did not know about a pair of old marble bathtubs in the basement. Senate bathtubs? Can you tell us about those?
Oh, I'd love to tell you about the bathtubs. They're quite a thing to see.
Okay.
They are a popular tourist spot as well. We do have two old Carrara marble bathtubs in the basement of the Capitol, in the Senate basement of the Senate wing of the Capitol. Now, those date back to about 1860.
Wow.
So a couple things to keep in mind. In the 1850s, they decide to extend the Capitol with two new wings, a new wing for the Senate, a new wing for the House. So that construction is underway. At the same time, they are building the Washington Aqueduct, which is what brought running water from the Potomac River, the Potomac Falls, into Washington, D.C. for the first time. So in the 1850s, all of these things are happening at the same time. So at one point, a senator from Maryland, James Pierce, went to the Capitol engineer and said, since we're building all these wings and we have running water coming into the city for the first time, let's create bathing facilities for the senators in the basement of the Capitol. Now that seems very odd to us today, but you have to keep in mind that in the 1850s and 60s, most senators lived in boarding houses. They didn't own their own home. They were part-time legislators at the time. So they would come here, they'd stay in a boarding house, and then they'd go home at the end of the session. And those boarding houses did not have running water. They didn't have bathtubs and bathing facilities like we know today. It was kind of like you'd see it in the old movies where they'd bring a big tub into a room and they'd fill it up from the tea kettle. Well, that's how people were taking baths in the 1860s. So to have the idea of the possibility of bringing running water into the Capitol to pour it into a tub through a faucet was cutting-edge technology at the time. Well, the engineer agreed, and they ordered 6 Carrara marble tubs from Italy.
Okay.
Wow.
And they were installed in a room in the basement of the Senate wing. And they did the same thing on the House side a year or two later. So it was there was both a House and a Senate facility. And those tubs became a popular spot on Capitol Hill. And particularly for the Senate, they became almost a part of Senate culture, because there would be 6 tubs. They were divided by walnut panels for privacy. They hired people like barbers to give shaves and massage
right.
therapists,
Oh,
we call
wow.
them today. They had luxury towels and soap. They were like a mini spa in the basement of the Capitol. And it became popular for a senator if he, and they were all he's at that time, if he was going to introduce a big bill or to make a big speech, he would go down there, he'd get a shave and a haircut, he'd take a bath in the tub. It was all preparation. Then he'd go upstairs and deliver his big speech. Very much a part of Senate culture. They also started to give tickets away to people to take baths in the Senate bathtubs. And so it kind of became a popular tourist attraction as well. Well, all that kind of hit its heyday in the 1880s. But after that, other buildings in town began to get running water and began to get modern plumbing facilities, that kind of thing. Senators began to buy their own homes by the 1890s or so. And by the turn of the century, it had just fallen into disuse. And so At one point, they were bringing in some new equipment, new electrical equipment, so they took out 4 of the tubs. They left 2 there, and they walled them up, and they brought in all this extra equipment. They were left there forgotten for the next 30-some years. 1936, the Senate is bringing some new air conditioning equipment in, and they want to use that space for air conditioning equipment. So they tear down this wall, and lo and behold, they find these 2 old marble bathtubs there. And you would think it was like this major archaeological find or something, because the newspapers were all, like, what's the story behind those tubs in the basement of the Capitol? There's lots of intrigue behind it. And people were asking about it, and they're asking the architect and the officials, and I don't know, I've never seen them before, Finally, an elderly man in Washington, a man named Abraham Lincoln Goodall, came forward to the Washington Star newspaper and said, I know the story of the tubs. And he talked about being a young staffer, a child, really a teenager, in the 1870s and 80s. And he talked about the heyday of the Senate bathtubs and how important it was in the Senate environment, and also shared the fact that he was lucky enough to take his first hot bath in one of the Senate bathtubs because he had received a ticket from a senator. And over the course of several days, he just sort of unfolded the story of the tubs. So today we still have 2 marble tubs down in the basement. They're tucked away behind all this old equipment that looks like an old 1950s sci-fi movie set. And staff and members and tourists can go down and view the tubs. Doesn't look very luxurious today, as our 2 ex-interns here will attest to.
That is true.
right?
They're kind of
that's
dirty and
true.
grimy, and I've argued through the years that it should stage one of them and clean them up and make it look like it did in the 1880s, but so far no one has listened to me. And
That's a
that
job
hasn't
for new
happened.
interns, right?
Yeah, there you go. But they're still there.
Now, unfortunately, we are going to run out of time here. We are running out of time. But you have talked about the public being able to access things. Can they go to a website? How do they find out more about these pictures and these stories and all the documents?
Yep, first thing to do is go to the Senate website. So go to senate.gov.
Okay.
And if you click on the section that says About the Senate, that will take you to the core of what we have on the Senate website. And that'll take you to essays about all sorts of institutional history, biographical information about members, all kinds of statistical information, party division through the years, all kinds of stuff like that. You can also come visit us. We're in the Hart Building, room 201 in the Hart Building if you're in Washington, D.C. And finally, you can give us a call if you're looking for, sometimes we have people who are trying to locate their grandfather's information. Maybe they had a great-grandfather who had been a senator or something like that.
Huh.
And they're looking for information for genealogical purposes or whatever. You can call us. Our main number is 202-224-6900. And we're happy to answer questions at any time.
Great. And this is second nature to us, so I didn't even think about mentioning it. But people can come down here and get tours.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we work with the Capitol Guide Service and the Capitol Visitor Center, and yes, you won't call our office for that. We would direct you to the Visitor Center, but they can set up tours of the Capitol.
I was going to ask too, is that Senate website where all the 12,000 different things are about the Senate and its history?
Yep.
For those parents listening, you could probably keep your kids busy.
Especially in the
We,
summer.
we do have a lot of great resources for teachers and students there, including a lot of primary source documents and images.
Betty, I just want to give you a chance to have a last word here. Would you like to address the importance of history, what you need to keep in mind when researching history, or things to keep in mind when you're walking around up here, whatever you feel like?
You know, what I'll say from the perspective of Senate history is it's important to remember that everything does have a history. So whatever's happening in the Senate today, it didn't just sort of erupt from nowhere. You know, whether it's the latest debate going on or the latest bill being proposed or whatever the case may be, it all has a history. And the Senate as an institution is something that really respects its history. So when we have very public events, they're often rooted in historical practice and precedent. And so it's really helpful to really understand the Senate of today, to look at the Senate of the past and see how it's evolved through the years, see why we have 100 senators, why they all serve 6-year terms, why there's only 2 senators from every state rather than in the House where it's based on population. all of those things that might have been decisions made in 1787 or the 1850s or the 1920s, they all play a role in shaping the Senate of the modern era. So to really understand the Senate of today, you have to look at its history and see how that evolution has reflected all the elements of their time period to bring us to where we are today.
Wow.
Betty, thank you for making history again today, being the first guest in our new renovated facilities. And thank you so much for being today's The Elephant in the Room.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
If you enjoyed today's episode, you can like or subscribe on your favorite platform, and it will notify you next time we come out with an episode. And next time we do come out with an episode, we'll be back on track interviewing United States senators. The Elephant in the Room is brought to you under the direction of U.S. Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming, our executive producer Arjun Modi, and in this extended cut of the credits, Carly Rapp is here. Carly, what do you do for the show?
That is a great question. I've helped come up with the idea of the show.
A little history here. Carly actually came up with the name The Elephant in the Room, and she deserves credit for it, does she not?
She does.
How did you come up with that?
I just...
Stroke of genius? Moment?
I suppose. I was toying with lots of different ideas when we first decided we wanted to have a podcast before there was a podcast, and threw out a couple different titles. Me and a few coworkers came up with different ones, and apparently this one stuck.
Nailed it. And Elena Seiler?
I schedule. I'm behind the scenes. I am in the
Record.
back. Yes, recording. I help with editing when you want some help.
I couldn't have done it without everybody in this room.
You've had a plethora of experience, so I don't want to steal the spotlight.
Well,
Not at all.
thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thank you.
Until next time, this has been The Elephant in the Room.